is Vanessa, and today I will be talking about schizophrenia and what happens after the first episode. The article I chose to report on is called What Happens After the First Episode, a review of progressive brain changes in chronically ill patients with schizophrenia by Paul and Kahn. So, just to give you guys a little overview on the history of psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia means the splitting of psychic functions. This disorder was given its name in the early 20th century, which described what was assumed at the time to be the primary symptom of the disorder, which is the breakdown of integration among emotion, thought, and action. Long story short, the brains of people with this disorder begin to deteriorate without time. And numerous brain imaging studies have revealed structural brain changes in patients with schizophrenia. These imaging studies have shown that patients with this disorder have a decrease of approximately 3% in whole brain volume compared to healthy subjects. Most of the decreases are more prominent for gray matter and than for white matter and are accompanied by increases in lateral and third ventricle volumes as well as an increase in cerebrospinal fluid or CSF. For example, in my book, this is a picture of a healthy brain and this one of a person with schizophrenia. Right here, the ventricles are more larger and there is more space around the skull that indicates more increase of cerebrospinal fluid than a healthy brain with regular size organs. Anyways, currently it is not known when these structural brain decreases occur and how they develop over time, but some researchers have postulated that the brain changes are already present at birth, but it is inconsistent with the finding that in adulthood the cranial volume of patients with schizophrenia is normal. What this means is that if that theory were true, cranial volumes would be smaller in patients who develop this illness because the cranium develops um, under the influence of the brain tissue growth and has reached 95% of its size by age 6. So that would be really inconsistent. So normally during puberty, after a period of both gray and white matter growth, decreases in gray matter volume and increases in matter volume take place, and the total brain volume remains stable. But in patients who develop schizophrenia, the the results show a decrease in gray matter just prior to and during the first psychotic episode. The issue that is addressed in this article involves what happens with regard to progressive brain changes beyond the first episode, an example in more chronically ill schizophrenia patients. In other words, the question that this article wants to find out is, are the brain changes in schizophrenia progressive in the more chronic phase of the disease? Finding the causes for this pathophysiological process could enable us to attenuate or even reverse the progressive brain changes. Deterioration is particularly prominent during the first 5 years after the disease onset and becomes relatively more stable after that. If one hypothesizes that our brain is undergoing dynamic changes, it's more vulnerable to disease impact than progressive brain changes taking place in chronic schizophrenia would be consistent with continuous dynamic changes that occur in the healthy adult brain. The healthy adult brain actually changes dramatically throughout life. In fact, decreases in gray matter and related increases in white matter continue into adulthood up to at least 35 years. Um, in this review, longitudinal MRI and computed tomography CT brain measurements are reviewed that include chronically ill patients and healthy control subjects. These studies provide suggestive evidence for progressive brain changes in schizophrenia far beyond the first episode. The methods used in the study included a PubMed search, which included the following keywords such as schizophrenia, MRI or CT, longitudinal, and progressive. The study was required to include patients with adult onset chronic schizophrenia, defined as illness duration of longer than 2 years at the time of the first scan. Also, the study had to include a healthy group of control patients. Finally, 10 studies used volumetric brain imaging methodologies, whereas one study applied an area of measurement based on CT scans. Both studies reported on reporting on brain tissue changes. An example, the whole brain volume, the frontal and temporal lobes, or the hippocampus, as well as those reporting on CSF and lateral and third ventricle volume or density changes were included. More information that had to be included was age at first measurement of each group, interval between the two imaging scans, duration of illness, antipsychotic medication taken during the interval, brain imaging methodology that was applied, such as MRI or CT scans, the slice of thickness in millimeters, scan direction, gap in millimeters, the brain areas in which the progressive brain tissue volume changes were measured, if any, the percentage change in brain tissue in patients with schizophrenia, the percentage change in brain tissue in healthy comparisons, the progressive CSF and lateral ventricle volume changes that were measured, if any, the percentage change in CSF and ventricles in patients with schizophrenia, and the percentage change in CSF and ventricles in healthy comparisons if available. Association between progressive brain changes in patients and outcome, severity of symptoms, cognitive functioning, and antipsychotic medication intake during the interval were examined as well. 7 studies reported on brain tissue changes over time, and 9 studies reported on ventricle and or CSF changes over time. In 5 of these studies, the measurement overlapped. An example, both brain tissue and ventricle and or CSF changes over time were measured. The percentage change in brain tissue and CSF and ventricle volume over time was calculated from the available material, if not directly provided in the article as follows. The average volume at follow-up was subtracted from the average volume at baseline divided by the baseline volume and multiplied by 100. Finally, to the results. Yay! From the studies that were retrieved, 11 studies reported changes in brain volumes over time in chronically ill patients with schizophrenia and healthy control subjects. All studies but one included subjects with an average age over 30 years at the time of the first scan. The mean number of patients included in the studies was 28. The mean number of healthy comparison subjects was 24. The average duration of illness at first measurement ranged from 5 to 21 years between studies. 9 studies were based on MRI scans and 2 on CT scans. The interval between scans ranged from 1 to 5 years between studies. Brain tissue changes were reported in 7 studies. Lateral ventricle volume changes were reported in 8 studies. Third ventricle volume in 1, and CSF volume changes in 2 studies. Cerebellum volume changes were reported in 1 study. As for the results on progressive brain changes in chronic schizophrenia, significant progressive whole brain volume decreases over time in patients with schizophrenia as compared with controlled subjects were reported in 2 studies. In 3 studies, no significant progressive whole brain or whole hemisphere changes were reported in patients compared with controls. Progressive decreases in volume and density of the frontal lobe were found in patients as compared with controls in all 3 cohorts that measured this brain region, 2 of which measured the frontal lobe gray matter. Progressive decreases in volume and density in the left superior temporal gray matter were found in patients as compared with controls in 2 studies. In 1 study, temporal lobe changes were not significantly different between groups, and in 1 other study, temporal lobe volume decrease were even more pronounced in controls than in other patients. Other areas that reveal progressive decreases in tissue over time in patients, as compared with controls included the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. Progressive decreases in tissue over time in patients as compared with controls were also found in the thalamus in two studies. In one study, the volume of the thalamus was measured over time, and a more pronounced decrease was found in thalamus volume in patients. Although at baseline, the thalamus volume was larger in patients than in controls. A progressive decrease in caudate nucleus density over time was found in patients as compared with controls. No progressive changes in patients as compared with controls in the two studies that measured hippocampus volume were found. One study measured cerebral, an example, whole brain, except for the cerebellum, gray matter volume, and reported a progressive decrease in patients as compared with controls. The one study measuring volume changes in the cerebellum over time revealed no significant changes in patients or controls. Progressive increases in left lateral ventricle volume in the brains of patients with schizophrenia as compared with controlled subjects were found in 7 of 8 studies. 5 of these used MRI and 2 used CT to measure ventricle volume, whereas the negative study used MRI. The extent of progressive volume decrease of whole brain volume in patients with schizophrenia was approximately twice that reported in healthy control subjects. Whole brain volume tissue loss in patients per year was 0.5% as compared with 0.2% in controls. Cortical, frontal, and temporal gray matter showed a somewhat more pronounced tissue loss than other areas in patients as compared with controls. The extent of progressive volume increase of the total lateral ventricle volume in patients with schizophrenia varied from 1.5 to 4 times of that in healthy control subjects. Studies that reported a fourfold increase in lateral ventricle volume in patients included a study with a 10-year interval and one including a subgroup of severely symptomatic patients. The extent of progressive volume increase of third ventricle volume in patients with schizophrenia was approximately twice that reported in healthy controlled subjects. And for CSF, this number was less than 1.5 times that found in controls. That is what this article is all about. And fun fact, I don't know if it's true or not, but there was a rumor that Marilyn Monroe suffered from schizophrenia. It was in her genes. Her mom suffered from schizophrenia. She was a paranoid schizophrenic. So it's psychiatrists haven't diagnosed her. They didn't diagnose her as schizophrenic, but there's this movie that it's called Norma Jean and Marilyn, and you should watch it. It's about her and how she suffers from her delusions and hallucinations of her old self, Norma Jean, and it's pretty interesting. So, want to take a look? Go ahead. Thank you for listening. All right, we'll see you next time.